Debates over strategies to control gun violence, and particularly whether we need better laws or better enforcement of existing laws, are often not well informed by information on what police are doing to reduce gun violence and on the effectiveness and limitations of those efforts. So to provide some further insights into these issues, I'd like to present some highlights from a recent study that I conducted with the Police Executive Research Forum on police efforts to reduce gun crime. Oh, is there trouble with this? Okay. Police efforts to reduce gun crime can range from gun trafficking investigations to crackdowns on gun carrying to teaching people about gun safety. But generally, little is known on how widely police use these strategies or on the outcomes of these efforts. While there has been rigorous research on some strategies, like the pulling levers focused deterrence approach and crackdowns on gun carrying, many strategies remain unevaluated, and we know little about the scope of these efforts nationwide. So to provide some further insights into these issues, my colleagues and I conducted a national study to examine the nature and extent of police efforts to reduce gun violence, to examine the perceived effectiveness of these strategies among police, and to make some of our own independent assessments of the impacts of these efforts. The central feature of our study was a national survey of local police agencies in large cities, which is where gun violence tends to be concentrated. 164 agencies responded to the survey, which covered a number of issues regarding gun crime, gun laws and their enforcement, gun recoveries and weapons arrests, and the use and perceived effectiveness of over 40 enforcement and gun violence prevention strategies. Today I'll just focus on a few key issues and findings. One issue we examined was the enforcement of selected gun laws, and we were particularly interested in laws that enable police to attack illegal gun markets. So things like regulation of private sales, use of gun registration systems, and the like. Now, these laws are not applicable in many jurisdictions, but even in places that have these laws, we often don't know much about their implementation or enforcement. And what we found was that local police efforts to enforce these laws, even where they are in effect, are often modest. So, for example, just over a third of the agencies in our sample were in cities that had a state or a local requirement for background checks for private gun sales. Yet among these agencies, only about a quarter of the agencies investigated cases of potentially illegal sales on a regular basis, and about a third never investigated these cases. Among other factors, agencies often cited resource constraints as an important factor that limited their efforts to pursue these investigations. And we found similar patterns for other gun laws as well, such as use of gun registration systems, regulation of licensed dealers, gun theft reporting requirements, and the like. Overall, these data suggest that we need to look more carefully at the implementation of many gun laws and at whether and how this can be improved. Another portion of the study looked at the use and perceived effectiveness of over 40 enforcement, investigation, and prevention strategies grouped into the general areas that you see here. And in summary, this is our list of top 10 strategies as reported by local law enforcement. These were the strategies that agencies were most likely to use frequently and to rate as very effective, and I'll just point out a few highlights from the list. First, note that submitting cases to the U.S. Attorney's Office was the #1 ranked strategy. A common problem cited by police is a lack of punishment in state systems for many gun offenses, particularly things like illegal gun possession and carrying. Federal penalties for gun crime are often more harsh and more certain, and so increasingly local police are turning to federal prosecutors to put more teeth into their gun enforcement efforts. We also found that local police are heavily dependent on ATF for assistance in gun trafficking investigations, as well as other targeted enforcement efforts. And again, this is also linked to the desire to get more cases into the federal system. Other top strategies reported by the agencies include targeting high-risk actors, behaviors, and places. So these are things like directed patrol and gun crime hotspots, targeting violent gangs, high-risk probationers and parolees, domestic violence offenders as well. We also found that multi-agency investigations and comprehensive enforcement and prevention initiatives like Project Safe Neighborhoods were also highly ranked by the agencies. I think many of these findings are consistent with other research and expert opinion on best practices in reducing gun crime. But we also found that few of the strategies were used on a regular basis by most agencies, raising a question as to whether perhaps some of these strategies are underutilized. Here I've just listed a few example strategies, and you can see how frequently they were used. And we found that even many highly regarded strategies like directed patrol and hotspots are not used regularly by most agencies. And strategies in a number of areas like addressing illegal gun markets were particularly underdeveloped. Now, there are many factors, including needs, resource constraints, and other legal or policy considerations that can affect the use of these strategies, and many of them have not been tested carefully, so we can't necessarily say they're effective. But these patterns do beg the question of whether these efforts overall could be strengthened and improved, and what effects that might have, which leads to the final component of our study, in which we've been trying to make some assessment of whether more intensive gun-related enforcement efforts by police can help to reduce gun crime. And to that end, we've been comparing the cities on a number of different measures. To illustrate, in this chart, we've divided the agencies into high-effort and low-effort groups based on measures of weapons arrests, gun recoveries, and strategies utilized. Now, I won't get into the details of how we constructed these measures, but note that the high-effort jurisdictions are marked in the blue bars, and the low-effort jurisdictions in the red bars. And for each of these measures, we find that the percentage of violent crimes with guns is lower in the cities where police put greater effort into gun-related enforcement and prevention efforts. We also found that rates of gun crime are lower in the high-effort cities. Now, we're continuing to study this issue with more sophisticated analyses, and so far the findings have been holding up in many of those analyses. But this provides some intriguing preliminary evidence that strengthening gun-related enforcement and prevention efforts can help to reduce crime, and that this should be a high priority issue for policymakers and practitioners. So finally, to conclude, again, we find that strategies rated highly by police include targeting high-risk places, behaviors, and actors, as well as multi-agency problem-solving efforts. And these strategies should arguably be given priority in policy and funding decisions. At the same time, we see indications of gaps in gun violence prevention efforts by police, particularly with respect to the utilization of some gun laws and enforcement and prevention strategies. I think these are issues that warrant attention. I think we need to know more about the factors that facilitate or hinder these efforts, and about the changes in policy and practice that may be necessary to strengthen them, and certainly further experimentation with a wider variety of strategies would be helpful. And then finally, we find that local agencies are very heavily dependent on federal assistance in their attempts to try to reduce gun crime. And this underscores the need for continued support of programs like Project Safe Neighborhoods, and for more support for ATF. I think more generally, the results suggest that there needs to be a greater emphasis on gun crime by policymakers and practitioners at the state and local levels as well, including not only police, but also prosecutors, judges, and legislators. And for those of you interested in further information about the study, a report on it will be coming out later in the year from the Police Executive Research Forum. And so with that, I'll turn things over now to Ed McGarrell to discuss federal initiatives to reduce gun crime.